The moment someone steps onto a plane, they expect one simple thing, that what they paid for, what they reserved, and what was confirmed for them will be honored without question. But sometimes, a simple boarding moment becomes an unexpected mirror reflecting something much deeper, something hidden beneath the surface, something that people don't talk about openly yet experience silently. When he handed over his boarding pass, he wasn't just presenting a ticket, he was presenting proof of his identity, his planning, his investment, his rightful place. Yet the immediate hesitation from the staff, the quick exchange of looks, the subtle shift in their tone, revealed that this situation wasn't about logistics or seat management. It was about perception. It was about who they assumed should and should not be in a VIP seat. That tiny pause, that moment where they tried to pretend something was wrong with the system, was the first crack showing the deeper issue. He felt it instantly. That uncomfortable sensation when someone tries to evaluate you, measure you, categorize you before even understanding who you are. They didn't see the years of work behind that ticket, the achievements, the sacrifices, the credibility. All they saw was their assumption, and what followed made that assumption painfully clear. They asked him to step aside, asked him to wait a moment, asked him to allow them to double-check something, even though his ticket was flawless. Other passengers walked past freely, unquestioned, unhindered, moving to their seats without interruption. But his path was blocked, slowed, delayed, interrupted because of something he did not cause. What made the moment more powerful was that he didn't react the way they expected. He didn't raise his voice, didn't argue, didn't create a scene. Instead, he observed. He watched how they handled other passengers. He watched how quickly they changed their language depending on who approached the counter. He watched how easily they dismissed him, as if he were an inconvenience that needed to be moved aside. And in that observation, he understood the truth: this wasn't an honest mistake. This was a moment shaped by their assumptions, their biases, their predetermined ideas about who belongs where. This single moment of boarding exposed something that often happens in everyday life, not just on flights. People make instant judgments based on appearance, tone, or perceived status. They decide whether someone deserves respect, priority, or fairness based on what they think they see. But the reality is that those judgments reveal more about the person making them than the one receiving them. The staff believed they could take advantage of him because they assumed he held no power. They assumed he would comply quietly, sit wherever they placed him, accept the downgrade without protest. They assumed he would shrink under the pressure of authority. Yet what they didn't realize is that true strength doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it watches, waits, and chooses the moment to show itself with precision. As more passengers boarded, the contrast became even clearer. A passenger who arrived late, someone the staff clearly recognized or believed was important, was treated with far more urgency than the person who arrived on time with the correct booking. That sense of prioritization didn't come from fairness, it came from favoritism. And that favoritism revealed the inequality that was unfolding right in front of everyone. When they finally told him that his VIP seat had been reassigned and that he would need to move to a standard seat, the room became heavier. The words didn't match the situation. It wasn't a request. It was an expectation, a command, delivered with the tone of someone who assumed he lacked the means or influence to challenge it. Other passengers noticed the tension, but many looked away, unwilling to get involved. That silence, too, reflected society, how people often witness unfairness but choose distance over discomfort. Yet despite the humiliation, despite the public dismissal, he didn't allow anger to guide him. He understood that reacting emotionally would only reinforce their assumptions. Instead, he chose patience, presence, and clarity. The staff believed they had stripped him of his dignity by removing him from his seat, but dignity isn't something that can be taken by force, it's something a person carries regardless of the situation. And in that moment, he carried his with unwavering strength. The emotional impact of public humiliation is something people often underestimate, especially when it happens in a place where everyone is watching but no one is intervening. When he was asked to leave his reserved VIP seat, it wasn't simply about being moved physically, it was about being displaced emotionally, being told in front of strangers that his presence did not hold the same value as someone else's. The sting wasn't in the words alone, it was in the tone, the dismissal, the way the staff tried to make it appear as though it was a routine decision, something he should simply accept without question. The entire atmosphere shifted the moment he was approached, and though he kept his composure on the outside, internally something tightened, something weighed heavy against his chest. Public humiliation is different from private disrespect. Private disrespect allows a person to carry their emotional reactions quietly, without an audience to amplify the impact. But public humiliation wraps itself around the moment, pressing into the mind, the body, and the spirit all at once. As the flight attendant insisted that he step aside, as they repeated their instructions with growing impatience, he could feel the eyes of passengers fixating on him. Some looked confused, some curious, and others indifferent. But the presence of their silent observation intensified everything. It turned the moment into an unwanted performance, one where he was forced into the role of someone being put in his place, even though he had done absolutely nothing wrong. In situations like this, people often feel their confidence slip, not because they lack strength but because fairness is being stripped away right in front of them. He felt that familiar rush of heat rising in his chest, the one that comes when injustice touches you unexpectedly. Part of him wanted to question them, to demand an explanation, to force accountability. But another part, the one shaped by years of navigating a world where assumptions can override truth, told him to be still, to observe, to choose his reaction with intention rather than emotion. What made the moment even heavier was the inequality in how the situation unfolded. When the other passenger arrived, the one they wanted to place in the VIP seat, the staff's behavior shifted instantly. Their voices softened, their smiles returned, their urgency turned into warmth. Watching that difference felt like a quiet slap. It wasn't simply about a seat. It was about who they believed deserved comfort and who they believed could be inconvenienced without consequence. That realization carried its own emotional weight, pressing into him with a force that words alone couldn't replicate. But humiliation isn't just a moment, it's a ripple. It spreads inward, reaching places that past experiences have tried to cover. It pulls forward memories of other times someone underestimated him, other times he had to swallow pride to maintain peace, other times he had to pretend that something didn't bother him even when it left a bruise on the inside. Each new humiliation awakens the old ones, stacking them together in a way that threatens to break even the strongest spirit. He could feel those old moments stirring, asking why this was happening again, asking why people still behaved this way despite the world claiming to be more evolved. Yet even in that emotional storm, there was a clarity that formed quietly. He realized that while they were trying to reduce him, he didn't have to allow their actions to define him. Yes, the humiliation was real. Yes, it hurt. Yes, it made him question, even for a second, the value they assigned to him. But deep beneath that shame was a strength that reminded him of who he really was, of what he had accomplished, of the power he carried without flaunting it. And that realization didn't erase the pain, but it stabilized him, grounding him in a way that kept him from reacting impulsively. He could feel his hands tighten around the handle of his bag, not out of fear, but out of the effort it took to hold himself steady. Passengers continued to watch, whispering to one another, wondering what he must have done wrong. That's the cruelty of public humiliation, people rarely assume the truth. Instead, they assume guilt, assume mistake, assume incompetence, because it's easier to believe someone deserves humiliation than to confront the idea that injustice is happening right in front of them. Inside his mind, a quiet dialogue unfolded. Was it worth speaking up? Would they listen? Would the witnesses even care? But another voice, the stronger one, reminded him that dignity does not come from being treated well, it comes from remaining grounded even when you're treated unfairly. And with every breath he took, he reminded himself that humiliation might touch him, but it could not change him. Not unless he allowed it to. Calm leadership is often misunderstood, especially in moments when emotions are provoked on purpose. When he stood there, publicly questioned, publicly displaced, and publicly treated as though he had no right to the seat he purchased, the natural human reaction would have been anger. Anyone else might have raised their voice, demanded justice instantly, or confronted the staff with the full weight of their indignation. But true leadership does not explode, it observes. It calculates. It chooses the moment that creates the greatest impact with the least chaos. And that's exactly what he did. The air around him was tense, filled with a mixture of embarrassment, irritation, and the quiet buzz of passengers whispering assumptions. Yet he breathed slowly, not allowing the rising heat of humiliation to dictate his tone. Leadership is not about controlling others, it begins with mastering oneself. Even as they insisted he move aside, even as they treated him like an inconvenience, he maintained a stillness that made some passengers wonder if he was truly unaffected or simply holding something far greater within. There is a type of strength in silence that unnerves those who expect compliance or emotional outbursts. The staff anticipated frustration because frustration would have justified their behavior. If he became angry, if he raised his voice, they could have framed him as the problem. They could have redirected the narrative to make themselves look like professionals simply managing a disruptive passenger. Calmness robbed them of that weapon. Calmness forced them to face the reality of their actions without the shield of excuses. Every time they spoke to him with impatience, every time they tried to explain their decision using half-truths about seat adjustments and unexpected changes, he responded with steady eyes and a measured tone. He wasn't being passive, he was being strategic. He understood that leadership isn't proven when everything is easy. It's proven when someone tries to push you into a position where reacting emotionally would only help their agenda. His restraint became a quiet form of authority, one they didn't recognize because they had already underestimated him. People around him began to sense that there was something unusual about his presence. This was not the reaction of a man who felt powerless. This was the reaction of someone who had dealt with challenges far heavier than an unjust seat reassignment. The more he stayed composed, the more the staff grew uneasy, because calmness in the face of disrespect often signals that a person is confident in a power that has not yet been revealed. Calm leadership is not about suppressing emotion, it is about channeling it. Inside, he felt the sting of disrespect. He felt the frustration of being treated unfairly. But instead of allowing those emotions to erupt, he allowed them to sharpen his awareness. He noticed every detail, the excuses they used, the shifting tone when dealing with other passengers, the favoritism, the lack of accountability. He observed, quietly building the full picture rather than reacting to fragments of it. That is what leaders do, they gather information before they act. When a person remains calm, they maintain control over timing, and timing is one of the greatest tools in leadership. He could have confronted them right away, but he understood that reacting too soon would only give them another opportunity to dismiss him. Instead, he waited for the exact moment when his response would be undeniable, when their assumptions would collapse under the weight of the truth he carried with him. By staying calm, he ensured that every action he would take next would land with precision, not emotion. Passengers watching from nearby seats began to feel a shift, even if they didn't fully understand it. The contrast between the staff's hurried, defensive energy and his quiet steadiness became impossible to ignore. In that contrast, an invisible power dynamic began to reverse. They thought they were in control because they controlled the seating, the boarding process, the authority of the moment. But control rooted in arrogance always collapses when faced with someone whose self-control is unshakable. His calmness created a pressure stronger than anger ever could. Leadership also shows in the way a person values their dignity. He did not beg for the seat he had purchased. He did not plead for fairness. He did not try to convince them of his worth. Leaders do not argue for their dignity, they demonstrate it. His posture, his tone, his silence held more weight than any loud complaint could. Calmness made his dignity undeniable, even to those trying to ignore it. And perhaps the most powerful part of his calmness was the message it delivered without words, that he was not defined by how others treated him. The staff may have attempted to reduce him to someone undeserving, someone easy to dismiss, but his composure communicated that their perception had no influence over his identity. Leadership begins with knowing who you are, even when others don't see it. Especially when others don't see it the moment he reached for his phone, everything about the atmosphere shifted, though the staff didn't realize it yet. Up until that point, they believed they held absolute control over the situation. They assumed their authority was final, that their decision couldn't be questioned, and that he would eventually give in to the pressure they had created. But authority built on assumption is fragile, and the truth is that real influence doesn't need to be announced. It reveals itself quietly, through action, through presence, through a simple choice, like making one phone call at the exact moment when the facade of control begins to crumble. When he took out his phone, it wasn't out of anger or desperation. It was out of clarity. He had listened, observed, given them every opportunity to correct their behavior on their own. But they insisted on doubling down, repeating their instructions with the confidence of people who believed he had no power behind him. They were unaware that the person they were dismissing had connections, authority, and a reputation that carried far more weight than any seat assignment. He scrolled through his contacts with the same calmness he had maintained since the beginning, not rushing, not making a scene. Some passengers glanced at him, recognizing that this was not the behavior of someone who felt defeated. The staff continued discussing the seat reassignment among themselves, completely unaware that they were seconds away from facing the consequences of their choices. When he tapped on the name he needed, his voice remained steady, polite, and deliberate. That alone hinted at the kind of respect he was used to receiving in spaces far more significant than a check-in counter. The person on the other end of the call answered immediately, their tone warm and attentive. He didn't raise his voice, didn't dramatize the situation, didn't exaggerate. He simply stated the facts, explained how he was being treated, and mentioned the flight number with quiet precision. There was a pause, a meaningful one, the kind of pause that signals something important has been set into motion. The voice on the other end assured him they would take care of it, and he simply nodded, as though this was an expected outcome rather than a favor. The calm confidence in that exchange contrasted sharply with the arrogance the staff had displayed moments earlier. Within minutes, the energy around the boarding gate began to shift. Staff members started receiving calls, notifications, and messages that caused their expressions to tighten. The tone they used with passengers changed, becoming more alert, more cautious. They glanced at him repeatedly now, recognizing that something about him wasn't aligning with their assumptions. Their earlier confidence began to drain, replaced with concern that grew with every buzzing phone, every whispered conversation, every sudden instruction passed down from superiors who were now involved without them even understanding how. This was the moment when the weight behind the phone call became clear. The staff didn't know who he was, and it never occurred to them that he might hold a position of influence higher than anyone they had dealt with that day. They believed they could treat him however they wanted because they assumed he lacked the power to challenge them. But assumptions are dangerous, especially when they underestimate someone who quietly built their life on leadership, respect, and results. As the minutes passed, a senior manager hurried toward the scene, their expression tense and apologetic. The staff stepped aside immediately, their previous confidence replaced by uneasy silence. The manager approached him with a completely different tone, one filled with respect, urgency, and a clear desire to fix the situation before it escalated further. Passengers nearby watched as the dynamic flipped entirely. The man they had seen being dismissed minutes earlier was now being addressed as someone whose presence could impact the entire operation. The manager listened carefully as he calmly explained what had happened, his words measured, his composure unchanged. There was no gloating, no anger, no triumphant attitude. True influence doesn't need theatrics. It speaks through the way others respond, the way authority rearranges itself to correct mistakes, the way people in powerful positions rush to make things right. The staff standing behind the manager now understood the gravity of the situation. Their faces reflected a mix of regret and fear as they realized that the person they tried to push aside had connections that reached far beyond their assumptions. His one phone call had set off a chain reaction that exposed the flaws in their behavior, the bias in their decision-making, and the fragility of the authority they believed they held. And all of it unfolded because he chose to act not out of emotion, but out of the quiet assurance that comes from knowing exactly who he is. And accountability has a way of reshaping a situation instantly, especially when the truth finally reaches someone with the authority to correct what others tried to hide. Once the phone call was made and the message traveled through the necessary channels, the atmosphere shifted in a way that even the passengers could feel. Moments earlier, the staff carried themselves with the confidence of people who believed they were untouchable in their decision-making. They spoke as though their word was final, as though their interpretation of events could not be challenged. Yet the arrival of accountability exposed just how fragile that confidence truly was. When the higher-level manager stepped forward, the difference in tone was impossible to ignore. Suddenly, every detail mattered. Suddenly, the same staff members who dismissed him, talked over him, and made assumptions about him were quiet, nervous, and overly cautious in their movements. Accountability doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it comes in the form of a single informed person walking into a space and making everyone realize that their actions will no longer go unnoticed. It was as if a spotlight had been turned on, illuminating the choices that had been made and the unfairness they attempted to disguise. As the manager listened to what happened, their eyes moved between him and the staff, assessing the truth not through assumption but through observation. The shame on the staff's faces made it clear that they already knew where the investigation would lead. They were no longer confident. They were no longer dismissive. They were no longer in control. That shift revealed something powerful. People who act unjustly often do so because they assume there will be no consequences. They assume no one will question them. They assume their decisions will stay hidden behind titles, processes, and the silence of those who feel wronged but powerless. But accountability pierces that illusion, forcing people to confront the reality of their behavior. What was even more revealing was how quickly the staff tried to change their approach once the manager began asking questions. Their tone softened, their posture straightened, and their excuses became weaker and weaker, as though they were scrambling to cover the cracks in their story. But accountability doesn't bend easily. It doesn't accept half-truths or convenient explanations. It demands clarity. And in this moment, clarity was finally beginning to surface. The staff had treated him unfairly not because of policy, not because of circumstance, but because of a snap judgment they assumed carried no risk. Now every detail was being questioned. Every decision was being revisited. Every word they spoke was being measured against the truth. He remained calm during this process, watching as the situation unraveled in front of him. He didn't need to raise his voice or argue his case aggressively. Accountability was working on its own now, propelled by his quiet strength and the facts of what had happened. His composure during this moment only reinforced the contrast between him and the behavior he had been subjected to. The more the truth came to light, the clearer it became that the treatment he received could not be justified by any legitimate reason. The staff had acted out of assumption, and those assumptions were now being exposed in the worst possible way. Passengers watched the transformation with a mix of surprise and respect. Moments earlier, many assumed he was just another traveler being inconvenienced due to a mistake. But now they were witnessing how a situation can change when someone refuses to accept injustice quietly. The respect in their eyes wasn't just for the way he carried himself but for the way accountability revealed the truth they hadn't noticed before. It became clear that what seemed like a simple seat issue had been something deeper, an example of how people in positions of limited authority sometimes misuse it, believing their actions will never be questioned. The staff began offering apologies, though their words carried the weight of someone who apologizes only after consequences appear, not because they recognize the harm they caused. Accountability often exposes the sincerity behind an apology. When people act out of fear of repercussions rather than genuine remorse, it becomes obvious in their tone, their body language, and the timing of their regret. But even those surface-level apologies proved one thing: they finally understood the seriousness of what they had done. They realized they had treated someone unfairly, someone whose influence extended far beyond the assumptions they made in those first few moments. The entire situation demonstrated how quickly things can change once the right person becomes aware. Authority rooted in systems and titles will always outweigh authority built on assumption. Accountability doesn't just correct a situation, it reveals character. It shows who acted with integrity and who acted with arrogance. It shows who remained composed under pressure and who crumbled when responsible leadership entered the room. And it shows how one act of decisive truth can dismantle an entire chain of unjust decisions made by those who believed no one would ever question them. One of the most powerful lessons hidden inside moments like these is the reminder that you should never underestimate someone based on what you think you see. People carry entire histories, experiences, achievements, and networks behind them, layers that cannot be captured by appearance, clothing, or the assumptions of others. When he walked onto that flight, he wasn't trying to impress anyone. He wasn't wearing badges of authority or symbols of status. He wasn't announcing his title, his accomplishments, or the influence he quietly held. He was simply a traveler, just like everyone else, expecting fairness. And yet, the staff looked at him for barely a second and decided they already understood everything they needed to know. They reduced him to a category, a stereotype, a box they believed he fit in without ever considering that their assumptions might be painfully wrong. This moment revealed how quickly people judge others based on surface-level cues. A person's true identity is never written on their clothes or carried in their expression. It exists in the unseen parts of their life, the years of effort, the responsibilities they shoulder, the respect they've earned in rooms the staff had never even imagined stepping into. But because he didn't showcase any of that, because he didn't walk in demanding recognition, they mistook humility for weakness. They mistook calmness for lack of power. They mistook silence for insignificance. And those are mistakes that many people make every day without realizing how damaging and dangerous those assumptions can be. What happened on that flight was not just about a seat or an upgrade or a mistake in the system. It was about perception. They viewed him through the narrow frame of their expectations instead of the broader truth of who he actually was. They didn't know the kind of decisions he made on a daily basis, the kind of influence he carried, or the kind of people who respected him enough to take immediate action with a single phone call. They didn't realize that the man they tried to push aside was someone who had built his life by outgrowing obstacles much larger than their assumptions. When the truth finally came to light, it wasn't just the staff who felt the weight of their misjudgment. Passengers who watched the situation unfold also began to understand the deeper lesson hidden in the moment. Many had looked at him earlier with the same assumptions as the staff, perhaps thinking he was simply another frustrated passenger, someone causing inconvenience, someone on the receiving end of a small travel mishap. But the way everything shifted, the sudden respect for management, the urgency in correcting the mistake, the clear recognition of who he truly was, forced them to reconsider how quickly they judged him. This experience exposed how easily society decides someone's worth without knowing anything about them. People often believe they can identify importance, authority, or success just by a glance, but life rarely works that way. Some of the most influential people in the world move quietly. Some of the most powerful individuals choose simplicity over displays of status. Some of the most respected leaders never feel the need to announce who they are because they know their character speaks louder than their title. And he was one of those people, someone whose influence didn't need to be advertised, someone whose presence carried its own quiet weight. The staff's assumptions were rooted in confidence, but a false confidence, the kind that collapses instantly when reality arrives. They believed they had the right to rearrange the situation however they pleased. They believed he had no recourse, no support, no voice that mattered beyond the gate. Their belief was built entirely on misjudgment. And when that misjudgment was exposed, it left them standing in the uncomfortable truth that they had treated someone unfairly not because he lacked importance, but because they assumed he lacked it. But the lesson wasn't just for them, it was for anyone who witnessed or hears the story. You never know who someone is. You never know what they carry. You never know who respects them, who they are connected to, or what influence they may possess. More importantly, you never know the battles they've already fought or the victories they've already earned. That is why underestimating someone is one of the greatest mistakes anyone can make. He didn't need to prove himself to them. He didn't need to explain his worth. He didn't need to raise his voice or announce his title. The truth spoke for him. The phone call spoke for him. The reaction of upper management spoke for him. And in the end, the staff learned a lesson they would never forget: you cannot measure a person's value by your first impression. You cannot decide someone's worth based on assumptions. And you certainly cannot treat someone as less simply because you fail to see the greatness they carry within.